back to the Valley to Peak Nutrition Podcast, and welcome to 2023. We're kicking off a series that is called No Off Season. No off season has historically been used in the training world to suggest that there's never a point in your training where you're not pushing yourself, that you're trying to maintain high intensity year round. That's not what this is. This is a common fix to a problem. Many folks wait until late spring or early summer to prepare for a big endeavor or a goal that they've got planned. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that timeline, except for the fact that their big plan is only weeks away, and the preparation to really be ready for that trip requires months of work. This series is designed to help you to get thinking about those things now, so there's nothing to prepare for when it comes time. You're already ready. As the old adage goes, the best way to get ready is to stay ready. The first episode, we tackle how to dehydrate your own meals for the backcountry. This is a topic that can seem quite overwhelming for a lot of folks, but Mark and I wanted to sit down and tackle what we have found to be the 5 biggest barriers that prevent people from getting started, why there really nothing is to fear, and some practical advice on how to get around those fears and to start diving into making your own meals. We reference a few key resources in the podcast, and those will be linked in the show notes so you can find them easily. As always, if you have any questions about something you hear on the show, shoot us an email at info@v2pnutrition.com. Hope you enjoy the episode. The topic's so big, like the way that I thought to break it down was, number one, trying to think back on before I ever dehydrated anything, trying to come up with like what are the biggest questions that I had, and then in the time since then, and since we gave out that guide, trying to remember like what are some of the biggest questions that people have in terms of getting started. Actually, do you remember back when you first started dehydrating, like some of the I wonder what I should do here with this? Do you remember any of the big ones?
I feel like some of them for me, and then some of what I hear from people now is just like equipment wise, right? Like what do you need? And then just being like, until you've done it, you're so unfamiliar with the process that even like understanding what it is. Like, and I remember thinking, I'm either going to mess this up and ruin food, like burn it or overcook it, or, do something on the far end of like, I way too dehydrated this thing, or I'm not going to successfully dehydrate it and then eat something that's like unsafe, if that makes sense. So I think just equipment process, like kind of what ties in with what I just said, like how do you tell when it's done type thing, when it's dehydrated. And then some of what you can and can't dehydrate. I think those big things come to mind. And if you see me looking over here, I pulled up your guide. That's why I think your guide's freaking so good though.
Oh, thank you.
It's just a matter of how much, like how deep do you want to get, today. So
Yeah, those were some of the same questions I had too. Specific, like I remember one of the, and maybe this even sort of addresses the question, although I know you know the answer now, of like, I don't want to dehydrate it too much, but the very act of dehydrating is like you're removing the water, and
yeah.
you can't overdo it. I think the one caveat, and we'll jump into this because that's actually one of the main 5 points, is jerky. I definitely think you can screw jerky up if you let it sit too long. The first one that I plugged in there was as like one of the number one questions, and one of the number ones that I had was, what machine do I actually buy? Right? Like, of all of the options that are out there, and like analyzing it at the time, one of the big ones on the market, at least one of the ones that seemed the most popular, was that circular Ronco one, which was actually my first one. Do you have any did you have any sort of flow chart decision making tree type of a thing that you went through until did you have multiple units that you bought, or how did you decide on which one to actually buy?
Um, for me, like research. I didn't try a bunch of different machines. I looked at like those circular machines like the Ronco you mentioned, or the common budget simple option. I did do some nerdery on like a top or rear mounted, or sorry, top bottom fan versus like a rear mounted fan in circulation, and what, like I have the Excalibur, so I went nice, but like what that does for drying and airflow, and consistency without having to move trays like up or down or shift them around. And size was a factor for me, where I wanted to be able to make bigger batches of things and dehydrate it at once and not like, oh, I have this great, cute little dehydrator, but like the actual capacity is pretty insufficient. Um, and then I didn't want anything like there's, especially now on Amazon, there's a lot of dehydrators with like timers and electronics and like touch screens and digital displays and all this stuff. And for me, I was like, I don't want all that. I just want something like simple and hopefully reliable. And so Excalibur kind of checked all those boxes and had a great, reputation at a cost, right? Like I think I spent $300, not 60 or 80. Um, but I also knew that I was going to do it for the long term. So to me, it was just one of those decisions where I was like, all right, I want one good, simple, reliable, capable one, not fuss around with getting the cheap one, figuring out I don't like it, and then potentially upgrading later type thing.
Yeah, I think this is probably one area that's worth the whole buy once, cry once thing, especially if you feel like if you have a hunch that you're gonna enjoy it and stick with it, it is definitely worth investing because you get nicer components and stuff. And I definitely tend to go in the same lines with you of give me the manual windows, manual seats because it's one less thing to fail.
Mm-hmm.
I bought a Tacoma once from a guy up in Washington, an old Pilot, and I was like, well, you know what made you go with all of the basics? And he's like, it's less things to fail. I was like, man, that's spoken like a true pilot.
Yeah.
The you made a comment earlier, and I think it's something worth knowing as people try to decide like what is a good option, and maybe you don't have a ton of options. Maybe you're like, look, I've got $60 to invest in this. I'm interested, but I'm not going to fork over 300. Do you find any value in rear mounted fans versus ones that are mounted above versus or vice versa, rear mounted fans being better, or I'm sorry, top mounted fans being better than rear? Do you have a preference on one or the other?
I haven't used them both, so I'm only like armchair quarterbacking this based off of what I read, and this was all research from years ago. But the rear mounted fan and the simpler like box design of an Excalibur is going to circulate airflow more evenly. And then if you have like a top mounted fan, it's hitting that top tray with more air, more heat, and not so much those bottom trays. So it's essentially becoming a little bit less efficient as the air works its way vertically, whether this is up or down, like through layers of trays. Whereas you take the same layers of trays, like my Excalibur is a 9 tray machine, but the airflow is coming from behind and hitting all those trays more evenly. And yes, front to back, you can make the argument that theoretically, it is hitting the rear of the tray more than the front. But I've just found that that fan is strong enough that it does work its way up front. And again, if you think top to bottom, it's not only working its way through the trays, but through the food, right? So it's not that it's just you have this tray that allows airflow. The tray itself does, but it's trying to penetrate layers of food. So if you had a vertical machine with like 6 layers, 8 layers, 10 layers, the 10th layer, you have air trying to make its way all the way through not only the trays, but the food to get it up or down to that final layer, if that makes sense. So that's the kind of the argument for the rear fan machines. It makes sense in my head. I bought that theory hook, line, and sinker when I bought my Excalibur, and I will say it is very consistent. So I don't have the experience with the other units, but that's the design intent behind like a rear fan.
Yeah, it's an excellent explanation. So I have both. I started and have done like the bulk of my dehydrating with that cheap Ronco, which is a circular kind of machine, and it's got a top mounted fan. And then maybe a couple of years ago, I think I bought a made with meat machine. It's like a stainless machine. It's got a front window versus being a top mounted fan or like a top mounted circular system. And then this has a rear mounted fan. I think that like it's all a matter of how much do you want to just set it and forget it versus how much are you not bothered by being inconvenienced. With the circular one, the Ronco one, your theory is 100% right. You get a very inconsistency in terms of drying. So the top stuff's going to dry a lot faster because it's the closest to the fan. The stuff on the bottom is going to take a little bit longer. But again, if you're not bugged by that and the cost savings is worth it, or you don't have another option, it's nothing that can't be fixed by just rotating trays. And like, this will make sense as you start to get into it, but even taking part of the recipe, and like if part of it's done, you take it off but leave the rest of the wet on until it's finished. And so there's a lot of different options, and it's all going to be really based on kind of if you're willing to be inconvenienced or not. I will say one thing that I do like a lot about the square unit is the door is on the front, so you can see what's happening a lot easier. With the circular system, you're having to not only take the top off, which isn't a big deal, but then you're having to like shuffle trays all around, and it can just be kind of clunky. So the square system, both of them will work great. You're just going to have to finagle the circular one better. The square one's much more convenient in terms of just setting it and forgetting it. And if you did have to rotate a tray, which theoretically you shouldn't because the air is distributed evenly, but if you did, it's just a matter of opening a door like your oven, shuffling the tray, and then moving on. So, yeah, in my opinion, what machines should you buy is going to be largely driven based on how much money you want to spend or have to spend. If all you have is $80, I'd say get the little circular Ronco or an equivalent brand. It will still work. If you've got the money and you really want to go, like the Gucci version, Excalibur has a great reputation. You can get a giant one if you wanted one, right? That could do your meals for an entire season in one batch if you wanted to. And I would say that my made with meat one is probably somewhere right in the middle. I think I paid $130 for it on a sale, and it's 10 trays if I remember right. So it'll still do a batch of chili, it'll still do a good amount of jerky. It's great for just me, I'll like right now, and this is why we're releasing this right now. I'll cook a batch of chili on a Saturday, throw it in there on a Sunday, and like I'll do that periodically throughout the entire year where you don't feel the pressure of an upcoming trip. And then when the season comes, it's all packaged and ready to go. You just grab it and you go. So I don't think there's a wrong option in terms of buying a machine. It just depends on how much money you want to spend, as well as how much you feel like being involved in the process versus just putting it in the machine, turning it on, and moving on.
Yeah. I will say that I don't necessarily mind babysitting stuff a little bit, but with dehydrating in particular, especially as you get into items that have a longer dry time, it's great to not have to rotate trays because there's plenty of things that I'll dehydrate that may be like an 8 or a 12-hour runtime. And it's so nice to be able to start that at 8 p.m. and then just have an alarm set for 8 a.m. the next morning and it's done. If I had a machine that didn't dry evenly, doing things overnight or starting something before the workday, and then when you get home that night, become less possible or less effective because that cheaper machine's not drying as even. So being able to just be like, oh yeah, 8, 10, 12 hours later, I'm just going to go pull this and it's going to be done. It's going to be even is really nice. I did misquote. I wanted to check my price. I went back to Amazon from 2017. Thank you, Amazon order history. And my 9-tray Excalibur was $200 at the time. I don't know what it is currently.
And I'd imagine like they've been around a while. I'd imagine you can get some good deals on them throughout the course of the year if you watch. And to your point, there have been several times where I've shut it off before we go to bed because I knew it would have been way too long just to sit in there by itself, and then turned it on whenever I woke up. So to your point, you're right. That is really nice whenever you can just leave it, let it go for 12 hours or whatever. You don't have to touch it versus, with the round one, it seemed like whether it was a meal like chili or whether it was jerky or even fruit, I'm constantly having to jump in there and check, okay, like what parts are done, what parts aren't done, pulling the parts that are, leaving the parts that aren't. And it wasn't like I didn't make a big deal out of it. It wasn't like didn't take hours out of my life, but definitely more of an inconvenience than We'll put it like this: it could be enough of an inconvenience that prevents you from doing it a second time. And
It could be. Yeah.
if that's the case, then yeah, I think personally, I think if you have the money set aside for it, get a rear mounted one with a get a rear mounted fan, square in shape, and I also like the stainless more than the plastic.
Yeah. Yeah, I love what you said about like doing this throughout the year and in batches. Because literally last night my wife made chili mac, which was one of my favorite meals to dehydrate in and have for the fall. And it's also one of those meals. Sometimes she makes it and we just burn through it, but it is a big batch. And so we have leftovers in the fridge right now that I've like, all right, if these aren't gone in the next 2 or 3 days, right? If myself or my wife or my son does not eat this in the next 2 to 3 days, it's going in the dehydrator. And to just be able to do that really simply is so nice. Like, yeah, I'm just gonna throw it on, put it in, dehydrate it. I didn't make extra food. I'm just doing this through the year. Dehydrate it, package it, throw it in the freezer, and it's there for September, October next year.
You're a better husband than I am. I usually just like make a batch of chili, let the delicious smell waft throughout the house, and then dehydrate the entire thing without
I
giving
do,
anybody
yeah. So
any.
I will do that in the summer if I haven't stocked, enough away, right? So I'll, times throughout the year stock some meals away, but especially once I know what all my hunt plans are, it's like, all right, it's June. I know I have, X many nights potentially in the field. How many meals do I have? What do I need to make? And I'll make batches at that time.
I think, yeah, one of the questions I've got written in here is what can I dehydrate? So I'm gonna, oh, I want to leak it now, but I'm gonna come back to it. How long? So this is like common question number two. How long do you dry the food? And I have found like what you had mentioned earlier. This is kind of one of those things that people are worried about. They're either worried about cooking it too short and getting sick, cooking it too long, and you said it perfect, quote unquote, ruining it. What are some average dry times that you've found between things like meals or maybe snacks that you've made or jerky or anything else?
Yeah. I'll say there's some variety here, and I'm just gonna like list some of my go-tos. It's like I have a document pulled up with just information that I've saved, whether that's resources I found online, which there's a million great resources to go look at online to get starting points, but then I'll often make notes of what I did and what worked, or maybe how I want to tweak it. So, um, like fruit, like apples and bananas, which I slice, do like a medium thickness slice. I'll do those at a lower temp, like 115-ish for about 12 hours. And part of this is going to depend on what I mentioned about the slice, like how thick is it to begin with, and then somewhat preference. Like with fruit, you can dry it longer and it gets like a little bit crispier, or you can dry it where it's still stable, but it's like a little more pliable and chewy a little bit, if that makes sense. And then wasn't planning on going here, but while we're here, speaking of slicing, if you're doing anything, whether that's fruit or jerky or etc., consistency matters, right? So we talked about like things drying at different levels or at different rates. The thickness of, in this case, fruit or jerky, if your slices are all over the map in terms of thickness, obviously a thicker slice is going to take longer to dry. And so I got a like a mandolin slicer, which is perfect for fruit. It keeps everything consistent, but it's also crazy, crazy fast. And so I'll just set that up and go through bananas and apples, and everything's consistent. Again, very quick. So that's like an example of something I would throw in overnight is fruit and let it go for around 12 hours or so. Um, like I just mentioned chili mac. So that's an example of a meal that I've made and it's complete, like it's ready to eat. Again, I could pull out leftovers of the fridge right now and throw it in the dehydrator. And I would do those a little bit higher, like 135 or so for temp, and then go 8 to 9 hours on that. And then there's some meals, and this is getting kind of down a rabbit hole, but like my spaghetti recipe, for example, you can make spaghetti complete as a ready to eat meal and dehydrate it. I've taken the approach of making the ingredients separate. And so I dehydrate the ground meat by itself, I dehydrate the noodles by itself, and I dehydrate the sauce by itself. And then I combine those three dried ingredients into the packaging, if that makes sense. So, um, just to give you like a rough idea on times, if I'm dehydrating ground meat, again, it's already been cooked. I'm taking it, dehydrating it. It's gonna be about 145 for 4 hours. Cooked noodles, I'll often use like a macaroni in my spaghetti just for packaging reasons, and we can nerd out on that later. I'll dehydrate that about 135 for 4 hours. And then the sauce, kind of depends on the temp, but it's going to go a little bit longer, closer to like 6 to 8, maybe 10 hours if you did it at a lower temp. So I know I threw a lot in there, but I would say anywhere from 4 hours to 12 hours, kind of depending on what you're doing. And that may sound like a giant what if variable because 12 hours is 3 times as long as 4 hours. But again, there's great recommendations and guidelines out there. And at the end of the day, this isn't, back to your point, Kyle, so sensitive that you can like over dry it, really, especially with ingredients like noodles or a sauce that you're turned into a leather, things like that. So I just started not knowing much, looking at recommendations that I found online. I would look at 2 or 3 different sources, kind of come up with the average of what people are saying and try it.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and you can you can like do what you had mentioned in terms of dehydrating things separately, and you can also cook them. But I will say it like you can cook the recipe as a whole and then dehydrate it as a whole. Like you could make spaghetti and dehydrate it, or do the individual parts like you were talking about. I will say something I've tried that did not work is you take stuff like quick cooking rice and even rice noodles, which are relatively quick cooking. I have tried to take the shortcut route. Like I've had dehydrated ground meat on hand, and then I've just thrown some rice in a bag, thrown that in, and thought it would be good. It is not. It is not good. You could prepare those things on a trip the same way you would at home, but you would use so much fuel doing it
Mm-hmm.
that it would almost be senseless to do that. It's way better, and I know it doesn't make sense to cook minute rice and then take all the water out and then rehydrate it in the field, but it cooks up so much easier, so much faster, way less fuel doing that. So take the time, even for something like that you would normally boil at home. You think, well, I'll just boil it in the backcountry. It'd be the same. It's not the same at all. It's pretty crunchy and it's hard to get good consistency. It takes a ton of fuel because you got to keep cooking it. So it's better, even if, like you were saying, even if you're going to do the individual parts before you go, take the time to actually cook them and then dehydrate them because it'll be a lot better. For pretty much comparable in terms of how long I've found that it takes to dry food. The one thing that I did find was, once you start, this is kind of one of those things that once you start, it will just make sense to you. And if it's still wet at all, it needs to stay on longer, right? Whether it's jerky, because most jerky is going to at least have a marinade on it. If the jerky's still wet, it still seems like just warm meat rather than jerky. It needs to stay on longer. If there's parts of chili or meal or soup where the outer edges seem kind of dried and crusted, but the inner part is still wet, like you pick it up off of the mat, off the silicone mat, and there's residue on it and it still is literally wet, it needs to stay on longer. So there's stuff like that you'll look at and just realize, like, I'm not an expert, but this does not look like it should. And just
Yeah.
throw it back on, like check it again in an hour, and you'll start to build a rhythm for some of these times. And like, I know that it can seem intimidating, but it is truly, at least I have found, one of those deals. Like once you get in it, it's almost obvious that it needs to stay on longer. Okay, this looks like it's probably done.
Yeah. And on that point, like, um, this is somewhat relatable to how I was talking about slicing, but same for like a chili. If you have something with, say, ground meat in it, because that's something for me is incredibly common. If I make a meal and notice any large chunks, I'm trying to break those up and spread them out. So not only larger chunks of meat, but just in general, anytime I'm dehydrating something, if I have the real estate to do it, I'm trying to kind of spread it out as thin as possible. It works out great for me for my trays and the size that they are to do that because with most of my meals, it's essential, and this is especially true for like say the chili mac to reuse that example. All I do for portioning is take like if I were to make a giant batch of fresh chili mac and I wanted to dehydrate all of it for, next fall, I would make the recipe as normal, just like we're going to eat it at home. And for what I do personally is I just like portion that out of like, all right, I'm scooping until I see what looks like a good hearty portion that's going to sound good in the cooked non-dried form and just put that on one tray and then kind of repeat that and put that on another tray. And then when everything's dry, I just know each tray is a meal. And it's like people get crazy with like weighing before and after and doing all this stuff. And that's fine if you want to geek out. But for me, it's just like, what's a good, like, what would I eat tonight? And I'll usually add a little more because in the backcountry, I'm going to have a heartier appetite. And then just put that on a tray and that's a meal.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean I've done that, and even like break it all up into a bowl and just scoop, put 1 cup in a Ziploc baggie. And if that ends up making 5 Ziploc baggies, like you'll look at that and think, man, I hope that's enough. But I have to remind myself, like, remember, this was a giant batch of chili. So
Yeah.
it's going to cook up. It will be hearty enough whenever you're out there. And yeah, you can get as technical as you want with it, but ultimately, like, and I think that this is true of all planning whenever it comes to nutrition and being able to go outside and enjoy stuff like on a big trip. If the anxiety of planning starts to overwhelm you, like, you're missing the point. The whole point's to enjoy it and have fun, right? And so
Yeah.
if you're obsessing about that, and I think that, so this leads into the third question: what can I dehydrate versus what can't I? I think so. Even if you're not a cook, even if you don't cook at all, I have. There's been times where I don't have the time to make something, put it on the dehydrator, and package it, and I will just dehydrate a can of chili. I will literally open the can, dump it on the tray, and turn the dehydrator on. Done
It's
that
fancy.
with chili, yeah, spaghettios, vegetables, frozen fruit. Like if I don't, a bag of frozen blueberries, pound for pound or ounce for ounce, is going to be less than fresh. So I'll buy a big bag of frozen blueberries, throw those in the dehydrator, and obviously the act of dehydrating is just taking the water out, so they come out the same as though they were fresh. So I'll take some of that
You go straight out of
convenience.
the freezer. I haven't done this, so I'm asking questions.
Yeah,
Straight out of the
yeah,
freezer.
straight out of the freezer. I've done that for veggies too. Like I've looked at some of my meal plans. I'm like, oh man, this is going to be a gut bomb. I've got to throw something in here for variety. And so I'll throw like a just a frozen bag of mixed veggies, still frozen, on the tray, and throw the dehydrator on. I've never tried this. You might be able to make the argument of less time if you let them thaw first, because obviously they have to go from the frozen to thawed, then to dehydrated. But
I almost wonder if it's the opposite. I almost wonder if going from frozen and having the low to mild heat is like evaporating moisture quicker as it's thawing rather than if you were to like let it thaw to say room temp, it's going to actually have a lot of moisture content.
I've
I don't
heard,
I don't
I,
know.
I've heard like of people that have tried it. They, it's not big enough of a deal for them to change. They still go frozen straight into it. And even I remember eating this meal actually. Even eating it, they rehydrate great. I mean, and I think in that, the mixed veggies so far, I've had everything from zucchini to carrots to corn to green beans to a bunch of different things, and they've all done great. They've all been great and
Wow.
added great variety into
I'm
it. So
excited to try this now.
I'll tell you another.
I'm glad I
This,
tuned into this podcast, Kyle. Thank you.
I'm glad you did too. This is going to sound very, very Silicon Valley, but I have. dehydrated kale and thrown like, and then, like, so once it dehydrates, it's very brittle. It goes super fast. And even like crush that up and throw it in with couscous and Parmesan and some like
You've
dehydrated meat.
you've only done this like while purely backpacking, not hunting though, right? Those are
Yeah.
two like
It's like the antithesis of hunting, right? I'm sitting there after a day of hunting, eating couscous with Parmesan cheese and crushed kale. That does sound very ironic, but
Uh,
sadly, it
well,
was when
maybe
I
it's
was.
like very inspiring to be like, I really should have had some protein in this. I really need to get something in the freezer.
That's right.
It's like reverse psychology and motivation.
It spurs on. Actually, sadly, that day we did shoot a grouse, so we did have meat. So I think the appetite for meat went down after that.
All right, I like it.
But anyway, it was good, and it added a little bit of color. And so I guess it depends on how bougie you want to be with it. But has there been anything in particular you've tried to dehydrate that you felt like, yeah, that just didn't work?
The one that comes to mind, and I haven't honestly haven't like researched a better way to do this because I've seen people do it, but I think it is sensitive or tough, is I tried to, and I'm trying to think if I did this straight or not. Anyway, pulled pork. I can't remember if it was like straight pulled pork meat, just, with barbecue sauce, or if I had pulled pork mixed with something in a meal. Um, but anyway, it did not go great. Parts of it were fine. Parts of it were like just gross. And so that one didn't go well. And what's funny about this is, sorry, Peak Refuel guys, but one of the only meals I don't like from them is their like sweet pork or something. So now, like, and maybe it's just in my head, but now the idea of dehydrated pork, like pulled pork, just because one, I ruined it, and two, I don't really like that Peak meal. I just haven't
Can't
done
do
it
it.
since. Yeah, there's probably a
I
way to do it. I should look.
I have, and you'll appreciate this because this is regionally based. I can't even get my hands on this stuff anymore. But my dad a couple of years ago brought out two. There's three quintessential Midwest things from home
I'm
that
so excited to hear this.
I know you'll hear them all and be like, oh my gosh, that you can't get here. So when he would come and visit, he'd bring them. One of them was ski, the drink, right,
Uh-huh.
which is like a different version of Mountain Dew, kind of.
The best barbecue place in St. Louis, that's all they carry for their fountain sodas is ski.
Is ski. Oh
Yeah.
man, there is one place here you can get a ski, and it is actually you may have been there. Have you ever been to that candy shop down in Bound Crossing? Has Steve ever taken you down
Yeah.
there?
Yeah.
You can get it there. Grippos, the chips, barbecue chips. Have you
See,
had
we don't
those?
have those. I'm aware of them, but we don't have them where I'm at.
Oh, you being like a spice guy would love those.
I gotta get on them.
Oh man, they're good. Third thing, and most relevant to this conversation, is Big B barbecue in a jar.
Also not in my area.
It's got to
Big
be.
B. I don't.
Yeah,
I'll have to look it up.
it's in a
Okay.
it's in a glass jar. Like, because you guys have a Schnucks, and I know Schnucks carries
Yeah.
it.
Okay. Yeah, I don't shop at Schnucks. Now I'm
Maybe
gonna have
maybe
to.
you know what the truth probably is that you've probably looked at that and thought, I'm not feeding that to my
I'm
family.
not touching that. No, I'm gonna
But
look it up.
we had a couple of jars, and for whatever reason I hadn't cooked it, and like it was on the border of being by the best by date. I dehydrated it. I threw it in a couple of meals with some like white rice, so it was basically like pork and rice. It was great. It turned out great. It dehydrated great. It rehydrated great. And I think that, like, as a small side tip, what I have found, and you may be able to verify this or not, the best meat to rehydrate, unless it's ground, is something that's been pressurized or like shredded.
Mhm.
So,
Yep.
like canned chicken, for example, is way better than your own chicken breast. And I don't
Hmm.
know if is has there been anything else you've found as far as like meat that's already you can just throw on the dehydrator other than ground?
Yeah, I mostly do ground meat. Partially from hunting, right? Is like I just have a lot of it, and full circle. I'm always like, oh, it's cool to, shoot an elk this fall and then put it in dehydrated meals throughout the year and then be eating it on my hunt next year. I just love that. So I do a ton of ground meat. But I remember we did a podcast with, I'm pretty sure the guy's name is Glenn, but he runs a site called Trail Bites. And when I was first getting into dehydrating, I reached out to him. I had all the questions, wanted to get all the answers. And so selfishly, I was like, hey, can you come on our podcast? And again, this was years ago, but I remember him as well as some other resources saying exactly that. Like, if you want to do chicken, especially chicken in particular, like skip everything and just go straight to canned chicken. And I think it is the same. And I would be curious now with pork, for example, like my bad experience of even those foil pouches, Kyle, that you've used and
I was
referenced, but
wondering about
like
those.
any of
That did
those
work.
rather than, no, I would be curious to try them
Yeah.
as opposed to like, if I have a pork loin or pork shoulder that I cook at home normally, whether, we smoke it, do it in the crock pot, whatever. I'd be curious with the pork, for example, to do like a canned or like a foil pouch. In that I know we talked about that years ago with Glenn of why that's the case. I don't remember to answer your question why, but uh, fully agree that canned or pressurized, jarred type meat seems to do much better.
Yeah. He may have they may be one and the same guy, but there's another guy who runs a site called Backpacking Chef.
It's the guy. Yeah, you're right. I think
Same
Trail
guy.
Bites is the name of his book, maybe. Now that you say that, it is that guy though. Backpacking Chef. It's a great resource.
Yeah, I mean, there's a wealth of information on his website that I believe is mostly free, but you can buy a
It
book too.
is.
But really, really, really good place to start. He's got a ton of great tips. My observation is the only thing I've never had good luck getting dehydrated, and from a food chemistry standpoint, it makes sense, is anything fatty, anything with like either a really high fat meat or a cream sauce or anything like that. And a lot of that has to do with the fact of, like if you were to put oil and vinegar, oil and water in a jar, they would separate. So with oil, there is no more water to be removed. So you end
Hmm.
up with kind of this slimy, not necessarily slimy, but kind of rubbery, oily end product that you, I suppose it would rehydrate, but the quote unquote risk is the fat would go rancid. And so it might have an
Yep.
off taste. It's not going to hurt you, but it might have a little bit of an off taste and a little bit of a texture issue, or it's just kind of rubbery versus you don't find that in really lean um, meats, etc. Besides that, I've not found anything you can't dehydrate. So
Yeah.
it's extremely versatile, and frankly, like yes, there's a giant cost savings when you dehydrate your own meals versus spending 10. I saw some like
10 would
some
be cheap, I think, now.
I
Yeah.
was going to say you're 100% right because I saw some small like cottage companies selling stuff for 14, 15, $16 a meal. And when you think about this, like it's, the cost of making chili, whatever that is, right?
I
And
was looking at, I actually had someone reach out to me and it was like a newer cottage company. And I'm not like their margins are what they are, very well, may be
yeah,
legitimate, but they had $18
yeah,
dinners. Yeah.
yep. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, it's not like they're in business for free, but at the same time, like if you spend you know, any significant amount of time out in the backcountry in the fall, that adds up really, really, really fast. So there is the cost savings, but more than that, truly the sky's the limit on what you want to take. If you've got a food allergy or if you've got a taste preference, or, some companies only have like 7 to 8 offerings and you're tired of those, or whatever the case is, the versatility that it offers to me is well worth taking the dive into and spending, a minimum of 60 to 80 bucks picking up a dehydrator and just trying a few things. And you'll start looking at stuff like even those Nor rice packets, taking that and a can of chicken, throwing it on the dehydrator, there is a meal. And that's got to be no more than $2 or $3 by the time you buy the canned chicken and that bag of rice. And that's going to make a decent meal after a long day of being out in the mountains. So
Yeah.
yeah, I
And I
think
think to add to the like the value of getting involved, because for some guys, I mean, if you do one 5 day trip a year, maybe it like, yeah, spend the $15 a meal or whatever, maybe. Or Mountain House is cheaper, but like maybe it doesn't make sense, at least for a couple of years. Obviously, the more time you spend out, the more value's there. But to add to that, use the dehydrator. I'm not using it constantly. There's times where I don't touch it for a while, but I will, especially as we get close to like spring and summer. we'll dehydrate a ton of fruit, use it for snacks, give it to the kids. They love it. They'll take it to school. We'll take it, on weekends. And, yes, for me, the biggest value I see in it, and the reason I started was to make meals for backpack hunts. But now just being able to do other things like make a giant batch of dehydrated bananas with cinnamon or apples, whatever. Like I love it.
Yeah, ditto. My wife somehow stumbled upon a, like a couple of summers ago, I guess it was, a bunch of like fruit trees with plums and apples, all sorts of stuff. So she started making fruit leather for her and her friends. She's had fun with it, and even thinking of snacks like sweet potato leather is delicious, and you can grind that up and make mashed sweet potatoes in the back. So there's so much versatility there. What about storage wise? And as far as nerdery goes, there's like a giant spectrum of throw it in a bag versus I like seam seal it, throw 5 oxygen pouches in it, keep it in a humidifier. Do you have or have you found one way better than another?
When I started, I went the nerd route and got special like Mylar bags and oxygen absorbers, already owned a vacuum sealer, et cetera, et cetera. So I went off that deep end. I now throw it in a freezer grade Ziploc and I'm done with it. So I don't do the fancy bags. I don't do the oxygen absorbers, et cetera. I do, if I'm not planning on using it relatively soon, I do put it in the freezer. And that's how like if I were to dehydrate that chili mac in 2 days, I would throw it in the freezer till the fall. Um, that said, I didn't do that for a long time, and I've eaten some meals that I personally dehydrated that were never in the freezer. They were just in my gear room slash office for 2 years, and they were perfectly fine. So I'm not saying that you should do that, but I've personally done it. I didn't die or get sick on the mountain. So yeah, to answer the question, I did all the geeky fancy stuff. Didn't see as much value in it. Just do a good heavy duty standard freezer grade Ziploc. And then I just pour the water straight into that as well, and eat out of that. And I'll do one of two things, pour the boiling water into the Ziploc. And then I do have like a little koozie to keep it in, just to keep it warm as it's rehydrating. Or, you can just put it in your jacket or whatever to keep it warm. But then what's nice about that as well is like the Jetboil pot, when you actually want to eat, I'll take that freezer bag full of food that's ready to eat and I'll set it in my Jetboil pot that's obviously now empty, and it just gives it structure. So instead of holding this floppy and hot freezer bag full of food, I'm basically putting it in the Jetboil pot, hold my Jetboil pot and eat, but my Jetboil pot never touch the food, right? It's basically the bag is like a liner, and just makes it very easy to eat. So that's another reason I like those standard freezer bags versus like the heavier Mylar bags do have structure. They're easier to stand by themselves, but they're not going to fit like in the Jetboil and yeah, whatever. There's a million ways to do it and preference involved.
Yeah, I just throw it in a standard Ziploc bag. I mean, it's just like your everyday common sandwich size Ziploc bag. And I'll do the same thing if I'm not, if I'm even if I were to make something today and don't plan to use it until maybe September of next year, I'll still throw it in the freezer. And I've pulled stuff out of there that's, gosh, 3 or 4 years old, and it still is tastes fine, rehydrates fine, didn't get sick, nothing like that. It still works just great.
And there's no like, because there's no moisture content, there's no freezer burn, there's none of that stuff.
Yeah, that's a good point too, because it could. I mean, who knows how long it could last. But you make a couple of good points. I rehydrate mine in the Jetboil mug, which is why I just use like a standard bag. If I was going to do like you do, which is probably smarter and less of a mess, and just use I probably would use a thicker freezer type of a bag if I was going to use it as a liner. The other thing, and I've had this happen, is depending on what you dehydrate, if you just use one of those sandwich bags, it will poke through. It'll get kind of pokey. Whereas I've used, like you're talking about, the thicker freezer ones, and that tends to happen a lot less. But
Yeah. And that, like, this is a nerd point, but I mentioned in my spaghetti, I'll often use macaroni. That's the reason why, is so like spaghetti noodles or even like a spiral noodle is going to have like sharper edges to it, whereas a macaroni is obviously more rounded. And that's to help prevent like any punctures. Again, like a minute point, but in my head, it's like a noodle is a noodle. I might as well use something that's a bit more packable and not going to poke through. That said, I have not had any issues with the freezer bags and, anything puncturing or failing or what have you.
yeah, and to prove your theory, that was on spaghetti. So you're right. You're spot on there. All right. So any last minute tips? Anything that you want to pass along?
No, I would just say don't be intimidated. There's great resources. I will plug it for you, Kyle. Your dehydrator guide, I wish I would have had when I started in 2017 because it answered all the questions and laid it out so well. Is well worth picking that up. And then we mentioned Backpacking Chef. That's the website. And then it is like his book is called Trail Bites, but I think he also calls his blog that. But anyway, he's had a great site going for years and years and years, ton of ideas, resources. So I think between those two resources, your guide and that website, like you have everything you need really to get started.
Yeah, I would just echo what you said, that, don't let all the uncertainties prevent you from doing it. And maybe it's a time thing too, right? Like you do got to find the time to pan some of this stuff out, like, plug it into the dehydrator and put the stuff out, but it truly is easier than you think it might be. And much of like your unanswered questions, you'll get into it and you'll just be like, oh, that makes sense. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So cool. Well, thanks for joining, man.
Yeah, appreciate it.
You bet. It's as easy as that. Those 5 key points and a ton of other information is available in the guide that I wrote on dehydrating your own meals. It's for sale on the website. It's $10. I'll put it in the show notes in case you want to check it out. If you don't have $10, well, if you don't have $10, you can just email me. I'll send it to you for free. Or you can check out the other website that we referenced, which is by the Backpacking Chef. He has just a ton of really, really great information and a few recipes listed on his site. You might enjoy that. And, maybe combining the two, probably get every question that you answer. When I wrote that guide, my goal was to basically take the notes on the questions that I had when I first started and put them into a guide. So I think that it's basic and it's designed to help people who don't know how to do this to start if they're interested. And it's relatively inexpensive depending on the route that you go, like Mark and I had talked about. And the trade-off, once you get into it, the value in terms of like just intrinsically how much you enjoy it and how nice it is just to have versatility in making your meals is truly priceless. So we'll continue the series next week as Mark and I tackle another really, really common question this time of year, which is, what should my nutrition look like based on my goals in the off season? What if I'm targeting something like fat loss? What if I want to build some muscle? What if I'm trying to increase my base for endurance? How should my nutrition change based on those goals? We tackle that and a ton more in part 2. If you have any questions or future topics you'd like to hear us cover on the show, please shoot us an email over to info@v2pnutrition.com and we would be more than happy to take those on. Thanks for joining us. Have a great week, everyone.